So then, we are back with more understanding from the time of the Second Tabernacle services, where we find in the Aramaic-English translation of the word. This translation comes from the original manuscripts of the prophets of the Tzayelic lineage. So then we can understand the time of the end, period Yeshayahu the prophet. Then we find the 61st chapter, then the returning of the cities of the Messiah, and then layering with Galah, chapter 1:8, related with the time of restoration. We hear then the Messiah explaining then the freighters of the earth in charge. So then, as we understand the system coming from the kingdom of the east, they should be coming shortly in the next 36 months. And then, obviously, the Messiah was explained then the freighters of the earth being in charge. And what can we understand the events until the freighters then become then the people in charge? What can we understand as far as mining, transportation, and fuel? Very important, pointed out, because the Messiah has given us many types of information, and we should then filter them through. As we understand, there is a very important reunion in China, and then New Zealand and Australia, very wisely, they are there, and they are flying over there to get this situation then somewhat resolved, besides other problems related with the environment, but quite honestly, not very relevant. But then there is a section of then the Australian economy on the news regarding then the refinery plant, because then the company related with the refining of the crude has proper documentation stating that it is no longer profitable refining then the crude in Australia, but rather having then coming from Malaysia. Very wise, obviously, but then let's try to understand what would be the importance of this refinery. As we can understand, crude is going to be extremely important in the future. The Messiah gave the answer as far as then the freighters of the earth, and they use a special oil, or then fuel oil, or then diesel for their transportation. So obviously it would be for the great benefit of the Australian government maintaining this refinery as it is, mostly for the usage with the crude oil, and then obviously using mostly for diesel, and then fuel oil for then the future. And it's very close, 36 months, it's not much time. So it would be very wise for the country or the realm then purchasing these refinery and then set aside. Extremely important. And not only these, but then amplifying or then extending or then refurbishing the port where this refinery is at. Extremely wise, because we already have the answers of the future. And as we understand from the point of the future of what the Messiah has said, and then returning from it as then steps of formation, we can understand very plainly the system coming from the east and then through the Pacific, and then obviously New Zealand, Australia. And this refinery is of utmost importance, maintaining where it's at. Make sure that it does not get sold. Make sure then the government of Australia has then the main authority over this area, because it's going to be extremely important. Not only this, but then we understand next year the Panama Canal then is going to be available. So we can expect big ships coming through with materials, where then we understand the kingdom of the south, or then Africa, is going to be absolutely developed, and lots of ships are going down there. And for this reason, we find then many areas where then crude is going to be very important. These are based on what the Messiah has said regarding freighters of the earth. The Mashiach is explaining of an area of a time after 2009 or 7009 until 7032. There is an area where we are active yet, as per the prophecy, where the Mashiach spent then a couple of Yom creation days with the Samaritans, indicating the level of the Gentiles would have a certain time during the time of restoration. So then we have come out of the 1,000 years of deceit, but whatsoever was learned during the time of the deceit is going to be discarded. The Mashiach already gave the answer. And the answer is the freighters are in charge. And what do you link with freighters? Always fuel. Fuel, space on port. Make sure the port then is extended, then is dredged. Make sure then there is a nice profound harbor where ships can come through. Either they refuel or then there is a space on a depot. Because you can understand this factor. Since the prophecies of the Mashiach are becoming more popular, the normal situation is the freighters or then companies wanting to invest their money, they're going to start their own freight companies. Because the demand for delivery is going to quadruple or more when the system comes. So we can understand not only the huge companies, for instance FedEx, UPS, or then USPS, and then DHL and other freighters of the sea, land, and then air, those are not going to be enough for the demand of what's coming. So you can expect, for instance, local freighters, for instance, the island of the Pacific, ordering then their parcels via the system, and those must be delivered. You can expect areas of the Pacific where must have refueling stations. So then this refinery in Australia is extremely profitable when the time comes. But then the most important is it's maintaining with its lowest cost until the time. And the time is very short, 36 months. It's not much time whatsoever. There are signs already of companies investing directly without the middleman and having direct investments. So it is already showing up signs of the system, and this refinery in Australia is very important. If they can get a hold of this refinery, purchasing it, place it aside, or give a name for it under the Australian government, it's going to be extremely profitable. And then obviously in Africa there is also lots of petroleum, and then the distribution of these fuels then obviously through the Pacific and the islands, it can be a very huge depot of the Pacific. So not only purchasing this refinery, but then thinking extending it, and then extending the port. Because what the Mashiach said must be completed. And we have the answers already. So then not only this, but then there is another problem, for instance, in New Zealand regarding then the aluminium smelter. Extremely important maintaining it. It's a part of mining where they can earn a lot. So then understanding these viewpoints, raw materials are going to be very pricey. There is yet an area of this time of restoration where China is going to be even further developing itself in dimensions that we cannot even understand yet. But it's going to at least double or more in a very short time. More factories of many kinds must be built, and they are already aware of this factor. But then, as much as they can get already then the material smelted and then prepare, then the more important it becomes. So these areas should be evaluated very closely, where those realms, for instance New Zealand or then Australia, they can own those places, because those are going to be very important based on what the Mashiach has said in the future. So we find then the system coming from the east, where then there is a factory of the east. We understand the system is coming, investments and purchases. At the same time, we understand that retailers are going to be out of work, because a person can purchase the same product for half of the price and can be delivered to their homes. But then increases the number of shipments. And in order to get this demand then completed, must have refueling stations. And then the realms under their government, where they can control these fuels, then they can make a huge profit out of it. But then they must understand that it is because the number of parcels are going to be doubling, tripling, quadrupling or more. So it has to have a plan related with the fuel. So then this, when the system comes through, and then those realms are then prepared. Because if they get rid of those places, then other nations, they are going to have those earnings for themselves. It can cause a real problem if they don't purchase at this very moment. And then making sure they have these developed so they can prepare themselves. Not only having the, for instance, the smelter, but then the port where it's at being extended for more ships to come and then obviously load with the material. So what's coming in the future is very important. The Messiah already gave, in quote, the roadmap for us, and we understand what's coming. But then fuel is extremely important. So then, as in any kind of economy, every time there is development, you are going to find new companies. So the competition is going to be very big. As these companies, they start out their own freight companies, they have to have fuel. But then the more fuel is available while these companies are then created, then the more they can work through their economy. So then it is always related with what the Messiah has said. And the freighters of the earth. The Messiah was explaining then in the future what he saw. He saw already these freighter companies in numbers that we cannot even understand yet. But they are coming. So then fuel is very important. And then raw material is very important. And then obviously when these places, they get the trust from the freighters. Try to understand that we are not talking about governments or realms taking charge of the fueling stations and then making deals with freighters. No, the idea is preparing the place where these areas can become in line with what the freighters will want in the future. Because it must be in order of what the Messiah has said and the freighters of the earth. But then if they work aside and prepare the way for the freighters, then they can make a very nice deal, such as then taxing when they are printing out labels. Because the number of parcels are going to be, in quote, astronomical. So many of them, people won't have space. And it's the reason why then, for instance, constructing depots along the port, many depots. Because not only those big islands, for instance, Australia and New Zealand, becoming then the depots of the area of the Pacific where they can earn the trust of the freighters. And then making a deal with them and then facilitating their work. But these must be prepared, because when the system comes, overnight is going to have a huge change in the economy of the world. That's why we must prepare ourselves at the moment, for instance, 36 months prior of the coming, when the ports are extended, when then the areas of the ocean with enough depth in order to have then VLCCs, for instance. Then we understand it in the future, after these are done, then the Panama Canal next year is going to be open. So we can understand the amount of work that must be done, but then the lining up with what the Messiah said is extremely important. And this is a great chance for New Zealand and Australia to become the very people where then the freighters can have trust and then taking care of the area of the Pacific where there no other place would. Great source of revenue. But then the refinery must be purchased. It is not risky, it is very solid because the Messiah already indicated what's coming in the future. So if the Australian government can purchase the refinery and change its name to their name, whatsoever name they want, Australia Petroleum were similar, where they can start earning from these because the price of the crude is going to change in the future. Crude is going to be extremely important. Not the same as we are understanding today because the demand overnight is going to quadruple or more. As if we were living in the USA during the time of the Californian gold rush. When it was discovered, there was a flux of people coming from every area of the country where then they did not even have enough hotels. And believe it or not, those people that were then providing with the shovels, those became sometimes richer than those finding gold. But then this situation was then overnight when the word came out, all found gold in California, and everybody went over there. When the system becomes available, everybody is going to be log on in the system, transfer their funding, and then they're going to start doing trade, purchasing, and so on and so forth. And then the freighter companies, they're going to find themselves overnight overwhelmed. And then you can imagine the fuel prices, what's going to be like. However, if Australia and New Zealand, they are prepared, nice port extended, lots of depot, and a fuel storage place, then they would be prepared to take on the huge task of the Pacific. Extremely important for their economy.